There is a moment almost everyone has experienced. You meet a man who is 40 years old on paper. He has a job, maybe a car, maybe even children. And within 20 minutes of talking to him, you feel like you are talking to someone who never quite finished growing up. Not stupid, not necessarily unsuccessful, just unfinished somewhere underneath. You cannot always point to what it is. He might be charming, he might be intelligent. But something about the way he handles conflict, or talks about his ex, or reacts when something doesn't go his way, makes you feel like you're watching a teenager operating very convincing adult machinery. This is not really about age at all. Psychological maturity and chronological age are two almost unrelated timelines. A man can be 23 and remarkably grounded. A man can be 55 and still be underneath it all, a wounded boy looking for permission to be okay. So the real question is not, how old is he? The real question is, what is actually happening, psychologically, inside a man who never developed past a certain point? And why does it look so consistent across completely different men, in completely different cultures, with completely different lives? The answer comes down to a small number of unfinished developmental tasks. Tasks that, in a healthier path, get resolved sometime between adolescence and the late 20s. When they don't get resolved, they don't disappear. They just keep running in the background for the rest of that man's life, quietly shaping almost everything he does. Let's start with the most foundational one: emotional regulation. A child, when overwhelmed, does not manage his feelings. He discharges them. He cries, he slams a door, he goes silent, he lashes out, because he does not yet have the internal machinery to sit with discomfort and process it. Healthy development is, in large part, the slow construction of that machinery. The ability to feel something intense and not immediately need to act on it. An emotionally immature man never finished building that machinery. So when he feels hurt, he doesn't feel hurt and then communicate it. He feels hurt and then he punishes, withdraws, goes cold, raises his voice, disappears for 2 days, turns sarcastic and cutting. The feeling and the behavior are fused together with almost no gap between them. Psychologists describe this as low affect tolerance, the inability to hold an uncomfortable emotion in awareness long enough to choose a response rather than simply discharge it. This single trait alone explains an enormous amount of what looks confusing from the outside. Why does he get defensive over small feedback? Because criticism produces discomfort, and discomfort must be discharged immediately, usually outward, usually at whoever delivered it. Why does he go quiet for days after an argument instead of resolving it? Because resolving it would require staying present with the uncomfortable feeling long enough to talk it through, and that capacity was never built. The silence is not strategy. It is the only regulation tool he has. The second unfinished task is responsibility. Specifically, the difference between being in charge of your life and being the author of your problems. A mature adult, when something goes wrong, runs a simple internal process. What part of this is mine, and what part is genuinely outside my control? An immature man runs a different process almost automatically. Who else is responsible for this? Not necessarily out of malice. It is simply the path of least psychological resistance. Taking responsibility requires tolerating the uncomfortable feeling of having been wrong, having failed, having caused harm. And if affect tolerance was never built in the first place, that discomfort gets redirected outward before it can even be fully felt. This is why you'll notice a pattern in how he tells stories about his own life. His exes were all unreasonable, his bosses were all incompetent or unfair, his friendships ended because other people changed. Listen closely to enough of these stories and a strange thing emerges. He is never the variable. Everyone around him keeps failing him, again and again, across completely different relationships, and somehow the common denominator, him, is never examined. Researchers who study externalizing patterns describe this as an attribution bias. Success gets attributed internally. I'm good at this. While failure or conflict gets attributed externally. They did this to me. Everyone does this a little. The immature man does it almost exclusively, in nearly every domain of his life, without apparent friction. The third unfinished task, and maybe the most consequential one for relationships specifically, is the development of a stable sense of self that does not depend on someone else's reaction to him. Children develop their early sense of identity largely through how others respond to them, through approval, attention, mirroring. A core task of growing up is gradually shifting that foundation inward so that your sense of being okay stops depending quite so heavily on whether the people around you are currently pleased with you. A man who hasn't completed this shift experiences other people's moods as direct threats to his own internal stability. If his partner is upset, it doesn't register simply as "she is upset." It registers as "something is now wrong with me, and it must be fixed or escaped immediately." This is why so many immature men either collapse into people-pleasing the instant there's tension or flip into anger just as fast. Both are really the same underlying event. Someone else's disapproval has destabilized him, and he needs the threat neutralized one way or another right now. This is also the psychological root of something almost everyone has encountered: the man who cannot simply say, "I was wrong." Not because he's too proud in some simple sense, but because being wrong, to him, doesn't feel like a small correctable fact about one situation. It feels like a referendum on whether he is fundamentally good or fundamentally flawed. Admitting fault threatens the whole structure, so the entire structure mobilizes to defend against it. Closely related is a fourth pattern: difficulty tolerating someone else's autonomy. A securely developed adult can let the people around him have their own internal world, their own moods, their own opinions, their own no, without experiencing it as a personal attack. An immature man frequently cannot. Someone else's independence, a friend with her own plans, a partner with her own opinion that contradicts his, a no that isn't followed by an explanation that satisfies him, can register almost as a kind of injury, not consciously framed that way. It just shows up as irritation, as sulking, as subtly punishing the other person until the autonomy is withdrawn and the equilibrium is restored. This is why control so often appears in these dynamics, even when the man involved would never describe himself as controlling. It rarely looks like outright domination. It looks like guilt-tripping disguised as a joke, subtle jealousy framed as concern, withdrawal of warmth used, half-consciously, as a tool of correction. Researchers who study relationship dynamics often describe this cluster as a need for control, masking an underlying fear, specifically the fear of not mattering, of being replaceable, of being left. Which brings us to the engine running underneath nearly all of these patterns: fragile self-worth wearing a mask of confidence. This is the part that confuses people the most, because it looks like the opposite of what it actually is. Many immature men do not look insecure on the surface. They look assured, sometimes arrogant, sometimes charismatic. But there's a meaningful difference between earned confidence, which can absorb a setback, a rejection, a piece of criticism, and stay roughly intact, and defensive confidence, which is actually a kind of armor built specifically because the thing underneath could not survive an honest hit. You can usually tell the difference by watching what happens when the armor is tested. Genuine confidence responds to criticism with something like curiosity or mild discomfort. Defensive confidence responds to criticism like it's a threat to survival, disproportionate anger, contempt, or a sudden need to diminish whoever delivered it. The intensity of the reaction is the tell. It's not really about the feedback, it's about how much weight that fragile structure was already carrying. So where does all of this actually come from? Developmental psychologists point to a few recurring sources, and they are worth naming carefully, because none of them is really about blame. They're about explaining a pattern, not condemning the people caught in it. The first is simply a lack of modeling. A boy learns emotional regulation largely by watching it modeled, not by being told about it. If the adults around him handled frustration through yelling, withdrawal, or stonewalling, that is the only operating manual he was ever handed. He didn't choose it. He absorbed it the way a child absorbs a language, without realizing there were other languages available. The second is the specific cultural conditioning many boys receive around emotion itself. The long-standing message, in many environments, that vulnerability is weakness. That sadness should convert immediately into anger because anger is more socially permitted. That needing something from another person is dangerous and should be hidden rather than expressed. A boy raised inside that message doesn't develop fewer emotions. He develops the same emotions as everyone else, with no socially sanctioned way to process them. So they leak out sideways, as control, as withdrawal, as sudden temper. The third is simply never having been required to grow. Some men move through life without ever hitting the kind of consequence that forces psychological work, a relationship that ends and stays ended, a job lost specifically because of the pattern, a friendship that doesn't come back this time. Painful as those consequences are, they are often exactly what triggers growth in the people who do eventually change. Without them, there is simply no pressure pushing the system to evolve, and the same patterns that worked, more or less, at 20, keep running unexamined at 40. Here is the genuinely hopeful part of this entire picture. None of this is fixed. Unlike a physical growth plate that closes for good, psychological maturity has no hard deadline. The nervous system retains the capacity to build new regulation skills, new patterns of responsibility, a steadier and less other-dependent sense of self at almost any age, but only under one specific condition. It requires the same ingredient that builds it the first time around in healthier development: sustained, honest contact with discomfort instead of escape from it. This is, in practice, what therapy does for the men who actually use it well. It is what a genuinely honest friendship can do. It is sometimes what a relationship ending for good, with no path back this time, finally forces into motion. The mechanism is always the same. Stay with the uncomfortable feeling long enough, often enough, that the nervous system slowly learns it can survive being uncomfortable without needing to discharge it onto someone else immediately. So the pattern, when you line it all up, looks like this. Emotional immaturity is not a character flaw in the simple, moralized sense people often treat it as. It's an incomplete set of developmental tasks: emotional regulation, responsibility, a self that can stand without constant external approval, tolerance for other people's autonomy, and a form of confidence that can actually survive contact with reality. All of which were supposed to finish forming somewhere along the way, and didn't. It is not a life sentence. But it also does not resolve itself through age alone, through success alone, or through someone else loving him patiently enough to do the work for him. It resolves the same way it would have the first time, by finally staying in the room with the very feelings he spent years learning to run from,